My name is Rachel Bennett, and the funniest lawsuit I have ever been dragged into started with a snowstorm, a cracked curb, and a neighbor who desperately needed someone else to blame. I live in a quiet subdivision outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, the kind of place where people wave from their driveways, complain about property taxes, and spend way too much money on snowblowers they'll only use 6 times a year. The storm hit on a Thursday night, and it was brutal. By midnight, the wind was howling so hard against the windows, it sounded like somebody was dragging branches across the siding. Snow piled up faster than anyone expected. Mailboxes disappeared. Parked cars became white lumps. Street signs looked like they had been swallowed by clouds. By morning, our entire neighborhood looked less like a suburb and more like an Arctic expedition camp. I woke up around 7, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood by the front window watching the city plows work their way through the neighborhood. There is something weirdly comforting about watching those giant machines crawl through deep snow while everyone else stays inside. The roads were still buried, visibility was awful, and I remember thinking those drivers deserved hazard pay. About 20 minutes later, somebody pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the glass. Not knocked, pounded. I opened the door and found my neighbor, Calvin Mercer, standing there with a face so red I thought he might actually be having a medical emergency. He was bundled in a heavy winter coat, snow stuck to his boots, and clutched under one arm was a stack of printed photographs. Before I could even say good morning, he shoved one of the pictures toward my face. "You see this?" he snapped. I looked down. The photo showed damaged sod near the curb in front of his property. Another picture showed a section of cracked concrete. Another showed tire tracks running through the snow. I blinked a few times, still not fully awake. "Okay," I said. Calvin jabbed a finger at the image. "Your car caused this." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't smiling. "Excuse me?" I asked. "Your vehicle was parked too close to the street," he said. "The city plow had to swing around it. That's why they tore up my property. You cost me almost $2,000. I actually laughed. Not because I wanted to be rude, but because the accusation made absolutely no sense. "Calvin, my SUV hasn't moved in 2 days." He folded his arms. "Don't lie to me." I pointed through the window toward my driveway. My vehicle was still sitting there covered in nearly a foot of untouched snow. The windshield wasn't cleared. The tires were buried. There wasn't even a handprint on it. "That thing hasn't gone anywhere," I said. "Look at it." But Calvin had already convinced himself he was right. That's the thing about certain people. Once they build a story in their head, facts become obstacles instead of information. He shoved another photo toward me. "I already reported your license plate to the city." I stared at him. "You did what?" "And you'll be hearing from them soon." His voice got louder. "You owe me $1,800 for the damage." At that point, I stopped trying to reason with him because there was no reasoning happening. This wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. He wanted a villain, and he'd already cast me in the role. After a few more angry comments, he turned around and stomped back through the snow toward his house, leaving muddy slush across my porch. I closed the door and stood there for a moment wondering how a person could be so confidently wrong. The whole thing should have ended right there. Any reasonable person would have looked at the evidence, realized the vehicle hadn't moved, and dropped it. But Calvin wasn't interested in being reasonable. Over the next few days, I noticed him taking pictures outside whenever city workers drove through the neighborhood. He'd stand near the curb with his phone out, documenting everything like he was preparing a criminal case. Every time I saw him, he gave me the same irritated look. Meanwhile, I went on with my life. I worked from home, shoveled snow, answered emails, and mostly forgot about the argument. Then exactly 1 week later, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope from the county court. At first, I assumed it was junk mail. Then I saw the filing notice. Calvin had actually done it. He had officially filed a civil claim against me seeking damages for the curb and landscaping repair costs. I stood in my kitchen reading the paperwork twice because I genuinely couldn't believe someone would spend filing fees to pursue a case built entirely on imagination. The claim stated that my vehicle had obstructed snow removal operations, forcing city equipment to alter its path and causing property damage. According to Calvin, the photographic evidence proved everything. I remember laughing out loud. Then I remember realizing I probably shouldn't laugh because this was now an actual legal matter. That's when I called an attorney. And what happened next turned a ridiculous neighborhood dispute into one of the most satisfying courtroom moments I've ever witnessed. Now, before I tell you what happened in court, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners get blindsided. According to standard procedure, cities don't simply accept accusations and start billing random residents for infrastructure damage. There are records, inspections, maintenance logs, vehicle reports, and usually multiple layers of verification before responsibility is assigned. But people like Calvin often fall into what I call the certainty trap. This is a psychological trap where somebody sees one piece of evidence, creates a complete story around it, and then starts treating assumptions as facts. Once that happens, every new detail gets twisted to support the original belief. From a legal perspective, the person making the accusation carries the burden of proving it. That's a lot harder than most people realize. Courts don't care about confidence. They care about evidence. And evidence has a funny habit of exposing things people wish had stayed hidden. What Calvin didn't understand was that modern city equipment leaves behind more than snow tracks. It leaves behind data. Lots of data. And very soon that data was about to become his worst nightmare. The hearing was scheduled about 5 weeks later, and by the time the date arrived, Calvin looked like a man who had already spent the settlement money in his head. The courtroom wasn't particularly dramatic from the outside. No packed audience, no television cameras, no emotional music swelling in the background. Just fluorescent lights, a few rows of seats, a judge with a busy schedule, and two neighbors who couldn't agree on what had happened during a snowstorm. But sometimes the smallest courtrooms produce the biggest reality checks. I arrived with my attorney, Daniel Cross, a calm, soft-spoken guy who had the irritating habit of looking completely relaxed even when discussing serious legal matters. Calvin was already there. He sat at his table, surrounded by folders, printed photographs, and handwritten notes. He kept glancing in my direction with the expression of someone waiting for a public apology. If he had known what was sitting inside Daniel's briefcase, he probably wouldn't have looked nearly so confident. Once the hearing began, Calvin wasted no time. He stood up and launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed. According to him, my SUV had been parked improperly along the street edge. The city plow supposedly encountered my vehicle, adjusted its path to avoid it, and ended up scraping his curb, tearing up the sod near his driveway, and damaging part of the landscaping. He held up photographs repeatedly. "The tire tracks are right there," he told the judge. "You can clearly see what happened." He pointed toward me dramatically. "Her vehicle caused all of this." The judge listened patiently and asked several questions. Calvin answered every one with absolute certainty. Not evidence, certainty. There is a difference. One is useful in court. The other usually isn't. When it was our turn, Daniel stood up and thanked the judge. Then he did something that surprised me. Instead of immediately presenting our evidence, he started asking questions. Calm questions. Simple questions. Questions that sounded harmless at first. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "these tire tracks shown in your photographs, are you claiming they belong to Ms. Bennett's vehicle?" Calvin nodded immediately. "Absolutely." Daniel picked up one of the photographs. "And you're certain?" "Yes." Daniel walked a few feet closer. "Interesting. Then perhaps you can explain why these same tracks continue beyond your property." Calvin frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel placed an enlarged image onto the evidence stand. The photograph showed the tracks continuing past Calvin's house. Then another image showed them extending farther down the street. Then another. Daniel pointed carefully. "These tracks don't stop at your property line. They continue approximately half a block." The room became quiet. Calvin stared at the images. "Well," he began. Daniel waited. The silence stretched longer. "Maybe another vehicle used the same path," Calvin finally said. Daniel nodded politely. "Maybe." Then he returned to our table. I could see the judge making notes. The confidence Calvin had walked in with was beginning to crack. Then Daniel moved to the evidence that mattered. Weeks earlier, he had submitted formal requests for city operational records. Most people have no idea how much information municipal equipment records every day. Snowplows aren't just giant trucks pushing snow around. They are mobile data centers. Route tracking, speed monitoring, blade positioning, timestamps, maintenance logs, GPS coordinates, and in many cases, dash camera footage. Daniel had obtained everything. "Your Honor," he said, "we would like to introduce city maintenance records regarding the snow removal operation that occurred on the morning in question." Calvin shifted in his seat. The judge approved the request. Then Daniel displayed the GPS route data. A map appeared showing the exact movement of the plow through our neighborhood during the storm. Every turn, every stop, every speed adjustment, every recorded position. Daniel walked the judge through the timeline minute by minute. Then came the dash camera footage. The courtroom monitor flickered to life. Suddenly everyone was looking through the windshield of the city snowplow moving through darkness and blowing snow. Visibility was terrible. Wind pushed snow across the roadway in thick sheets. The plow advanced slowly down our street. For several seconds, nothing unusual happened. Then it approached the section in front of Calvin's property. Daniel paused the video. "Please note the timestamp," he said. "Nearly 3 o'clock in the morning." The video resumed. The plow rolled forward. Suddenly the blade struck something hidden beneath the snow. The impact jolted the entire vehicle. You could actually see the front end bounce. Later records identified it as a frozen manhole cover protruding slightly above the pavement. The force pushed the blade sideways. In the next instant, the steel edge scraped directly against the curb line near Calvin's driveway. Sparks flashed briefly. Chunks of snow and ice exploded outward. The footage continued for several more seconds before the operator corrected course and proceeded down the street. Daniel paused the video again. Nobody said a word. Then he zoomed into another portion of the recording. My driveway appeared on screen. There sat my SUV, completely covered in fresh snow, untouched, motionless. The snow layer across the hood and windshield was smooth and unbroken. There was no evidence whatsoever that the vehicle had moved recently. In fact, it looked exactly the way I had described it from the very beginning. The judge leaned forward. Calvin stared at the screen. His face seemed to lose color with every passing second. Daniel wasn't finished. He introduced maintenance reports generated after the incident. The city had already documented the curb damage internally. Their preliminary assessment identified contact from snow removal equipment as the probable cause. There was never any mention of a private vehicle. There was never any citation issued against me. There was never any evidence connecting my SUV to the incident. The entire claim rested on Calvin's assumption. And assumptions don't survive long when objective records start showing up. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes. Calvin attempted to argue that the city records might somehow be incomplete. Then he suggested the camera angle could be misleading. Then he claimed the damage may have involved multiple causes. Each explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. The problem with building a case on imagination is that reality only has to show up once. Eventually, the judge set down the paperwork and looked directly at Calvin. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "do you possess any evidence contradicting these city records?" Calvin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. The judge nodded. Then she delivered the words I had been waiting weeks to hear. "Case dismissed." Just like that. No drama. No suspense. No drawn-out debate. Dismissed. But then something happened that made the moment even better. The judge wasn't happy. She explained that filing claims requires a reasonable factual basis. While people are entitled to seek compensation when they genuinely believe they've been harmed, the court system is not intended to be used as a weapon against neighbors based solely on speculation. She stopped short of imposing sanctions, but her warning was crystal clear. "You are fortunate," she told Calvin, "that this matter ends here. I don't think I've ever seen a person's confidence evaporate so quickly." Calvin's face turned a remarkable shade somewhere between red and purple. He gathered his papers without making eye contact. The stack of photographs that had seemed so powerful a few hours earlier now looked ridiculous. As we left the courtroom, Daniel simply smiled and said, "Data usually tells the truth." A month later, city repair crews arrived and fixed the damaged curb. They patched the concrete, restored the affected area, and completed the work at no cost to any resident. One of the workers even laughed when he recognized the address from the maintenance report. Apparently, the incident had become a minor source of amusement within the department. I never received an apology from Calvin. Honestly, I wasn't expecting one. People who spend weeks convincing themselves they're right rarely admit otherwise overnight. But I did send him something. A copy of the city's repair invoice. Total amount due from Rachel Bennett, $0. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. And after everything that happened, that felt far more satisfying than any argument ever could. A few months after everything settled down, the snow was gone, the grass had grown back, and life in the neighborhood returned to normal, at least on the surface. But every now and then I'd walk past that repaired curb and think about how close some people come to creating disasters simply because they refuse to admit they might be wrong. Looking back, the damaged concrete was never the real issue. The real issue was what happened inside Calvin's head long before he ever knocked on my door. Somewhere between seeing those tire marks and printing those photographs, he stopped investigating and started constructing a story. Once that story felt true to him, every fact that didn't fit became something to ignore. This is a psychological trap that catches far more people than most of us realize. We all like to think we're rational. We all like to believe we follow evidence wherever it leads. But sometimes people decide on a conclusion first and then spend all their energy searching for proof afterward. That's not investigation. That's confirmation bias, wearing a detective costume. The lesson here is that certainty can be incredibly dangerous when it arrives before the facts. And honestly, this doesn't just apply to neighbors arguing over snow damage. It applies to HOA disputes, property disagreements, workplace conflicts, family arguments, and just about every corner of modern life. People see one piece of information, assume they know the entire story, and then charge forward like they're carrying a banner of truth. From a legal perspective, that's exactly why documentation matters so much. Courts aren't designed to reward whoever tells the most emotional story. They're designed to evaluate evidence. According to standard procedure, claims require support, accusations require proof, and opinions are not automatically facts simply because someone repeats them loudly enough. The interesting thing is that technology played a bigger role in this story than either of us realized at the beginning. 20 years ago, this might have become a messy he said, she said argument with no clear resolution. Instead, GPS logs, operational records, timestamps, and camera footage created an objective record that nobody could argue with. The truth was sitting quietly inside a database long before either side entered a courtroom. And that's another lesson worth remembering. Facts don't always speak immediately, but eventually they tend to catch up with people. I also learned something about handling conflict. A younger version of me probably would have marched across the street and started arguing the moment Calvin accused me. I would have tried to win the debate. I would have tried to prove him wrong. But experience has taught me that not every accusation deserves an emotional response. Sometimes the smartest move is to stay calm, collect information, and let the process do its job. That's much less satisfying in the moment, but it usually produces better outcomes. The funny part is that some viewers will probably think the best moment of this story was when the judge dismissed the case. Others will say it was the dash camera footage showing exactly what happened. A few of you might even say it was the repair invoice I mailed afterward. Personally, I think the best moment happened much earlier. It was the moment I stopped worrying. The moment I realized the facts were on my side. Once I understood that, the outcome became a matter of time rather than fear. So now I'm curious what you think. Have you ever had a neighbor, HOA board member, contractor, or coworker accuse you of something that turned out to be completely wrong? Did they eventually admit it, or did they keep doubling down even after the evidence showed otherwise? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this happen more often than people realize. And if there's one final takeaway from all of this, it's simple. Don't confuse confidence with truth. The loudest person in the room isn't always right. The angriest person isn't always the victim. And sometimes a set of Snowplow GPS records can accomplish more than 1,000 arguments ever could. In the end, I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I was smarter. I won because the truth happened to leave tracks behind, And unlike the ones in Calvin's photographs, those tracks actually led somewhere real.